context, Matt, on Sweetheart of the Rodeo is going to be important here because it is a very, very different Byrds album.
Yeah, we covered we covered a Byrds album already, I think in our second episode, Younger
Yes.
Than Yesterday, which was the Byrds' fourth album. And this is their sixth album, which just missed the top 100 of the best albums ever lists that were going by for the 1960s. This one charts in at number 106. So my initial reaction when I saw that, it was like, oh man, I was disappointed. I really wanted to talk about this because
I think you even referenced it in the episode, in one of the episodes earlier.
I did, and so that was before obviously I knew we would get these opportunities. So yeah, as soon as we realized Josh is doing his thing, we still wanted to record. So I thought that this was a good opportunity to actually talk about that record because it's pretty important for a variety of reasons, really. But it was released in 1968, and it was ranked the number 22 album in 1968, and it just missed the top 1,000 albums of all time. This is 1,001. So,
oh wow, it really did just miss. You're not kidding.
Yes. So it was just a quick history of just, the situation that was going on with the Byrds and with the release of this album. It was released on August 30th, 1968, and it was the Byrds' sixth album. And it was probably, if you look back at their discography, it was probably the last album that the Byrds made that really had any type of critical acclaim or significance, really. The Byrds did have several albums afterwards, but none of them really took to the level of this album, the albums prior to it. So this was it was a significant departure in regards to the sound and the genre that they were used to doing. But
everything, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, there was a little hints of it. It's essentially
including the band members, because it's probably important to tell you who's not here this episode.
Yeah, so you don't have David Crosby. He got the boot already in 1967, and then their drummer Michael Clark was dismissed from the band in late 1967. So really, you're just dealing with Roger McGuinn, who is the front man, lead singer, guitar player, and Chris Hillman, who is the bass player. And Hillman had some country influence in previous records. He actually was, before being in the Byrds, in a bluegrass band, as I mentioned in the last episode. So after the departure of those two members, they basically got a drummer who was actually Hillman's cousin. So his name was Kevin Kelly. So he ended up playing, and the three of them ended up touring as a trio. They had a college tour that they were touring as a trio, but then they realized that they really couldn't get the sounds that they wanted to replicate from their albums, and figured that they needed a fourth member. And that's where
they found one.
They sure did. And a young Graham Parsons, who was actually an acquaintance of Hillman's, they met, oddly enough, in a line at a bank. They were both in line in a bank and somehow struck up a conversation, and part of that conversation, I am assuming, had something to do with their mutual affection for music. So Parsons basically came in through Hillman, who and the initial intention was for him to be the piano player, but he soon morphed into a guitar player for the band. So this album was
so much interesting there. Besides just them meeting at a bank and being good enough to stay in the Byrds, the fact that, I was going to play piano, but you know what? Let's just go ahead and go guitar while we're at it. Let's just change the sound of the band entirely while we're at it.
Yeah. But the idea of changing the sound of a band wasn't entirely Parsons. Roger McGuinn, his initial intention for this album was to make a sprawling double album that was going to cover a history of music in America. So he wanted to start it off with, the early American music, bluegrass, Appalachian music, move down the road into country and Western, hit some jazz, R&B.
Can you imagine how bad that album would have been? I love the Byrds, but can you imagine how just bloated it would make Sandinista by the Clash look like?
Well, it would certainly be
an LP.
It would certainly be bloated. But as this, if they could have hit the bluegrass and the country and Western as they did in this album, they certainly had rock down, the jazz. Right. But then this is the best, John, was they not only wanted to cover all those genres, but they wanted to, the culmination was supposed to be what someone recalled a futuristic proto-electronica, whatever the hell that ended up, what it would have been. So,
I don't think they ever visited that in terms of their own work there, but that would have been something else.
Yeah. So they get Parsons in. So Parsons was very young, and he was very much into country and Western music, but he also appreciated rock and roll. And one of his missions in life was to kind of bring country and Western music into, to make it cool, really, right? To bring it into, the masses, not just, the honky tonks in the middle of nowhere. He wanted this to kind of be a reputable musical genre with, some of the cooler, quote unquote, cooler crowds in America. So he was really pushing for more of that sound with the band. And he was
like 19 or 20, right? I think
he was 21, maybe.
21, okay.
But very young. He did have an album already with his first band. He had a band before this, and that band was called the International Submarine Band. And they had an album that came out. It was really ready to go in December of 1967, but pretty much shortly after that, I think Parsons joined the Byrds around February of 68. And because of that, his focus was solely on the Byrds. That was certainly a step up. I mean, the Byrds were a very reputable, popular, renowned band. And so
can you imagine just talking yourself into like a top 5 band in the world at a bank line? You know what I mean?
It's pretty amazing. Yeah. And so I didn't really find much more detail. It just seemed like there was some sort of, something that Hillman and the rest of the band saw in him that just made them go, this is our guy. Right. So I didn't really find out any more stories of interest about that, but to say the least, he was able to join the band. So that album by the International Submarine Band came out later on. I think it might have been in March of 68. So that was right around the time that, Parsons joined the Byrds. So he convinced Hillman, the producer, and as well as the producer for the Byrds, to go in this direction. And I think Roger McGuinn was the last one to jump on board, but he finally relented. And they just crafted this album that is pretty much straight up country. I mean, people refer to it as country rock.
Oh, yeah. There's
not much rock and roll that you can see is when you listen to this. I don't think many people are going to hear this album and go, that's rock and roll, right? This is more of a country album done by a rock and roll band, which is really where this album generates its aura from, because other bands had tried to do country before that were more in the rock setting, but a lot of times it was kind of tongue in cheek, or they were kind of making fun at it. This was a real, true, earnest, effort to create a country album. So it wasn't.
It is. It absolutely. I think they basically took the jangle guitar of Roger McGuinn and just parked it in the garage, with the exception of the last song. I think Nothing Was Delivered, right? Is that's the last track? That did have some of the jangle guitar and like a light in the distance to previous albums. It comes out, but it's outside of that. It is missing in action.
Yeah, it's a lot of fiddle. It's a
banjo.
lot of banjo and slide guitars everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like every other song is a waltz. It's done in that 1, 2, 3 time, which when you couple it with all those other instruments, it's a very country album.
Lyrics are very traditional Americana.
Yep.
Religious overtones, moralistic. So almost kind of, as we talked about that Fairport Convention album before, how they went into sort of mythology.
Right.
This album does the same thing with Americana themes, but not in the way that, say, a Bob Dylan does, in a very, very country way.
Yes.
Not so much in a rock-oriented take on country way.
Correct. And it's interesting that there were only 2 originals that were written for this. So all the songs are pretty much, it's bookended by Dylan covers. So surprise, the Byrds are covering Dylan twice on this album.
And surprise, they're the 2 best songs on the album. How about that?
Yeah, possibly. I do like the opening track. It's You Ain't Going Nowhere. Actually, both of the songs, You Ain't Going Nowhere and Nothing Was Delivered, were both songs that were actually not really released as Dylan songs, because they were part of the Basement tapes, the recordings that Dylan did with members of the band that were essentially bootlegs. So they're Dylan covers, but they weren't. It's not like they were covering like a Rolling Stone or Mr. Tambourine Man or anything like that. These were kind of unknown, but they were still Dylan songs. But there were only 2 original songs on the album. Both of them were written by Parsons. They were Hickory Wind and 100 Years From Now. But all the other ones were like Louvin Brothers. There's a Woody Guthrie song in there. I believe there's a Merle Haggard song.
Parsons' songs sound even more country than the Merle Haggard and the country standards in some ways.
Yeah, Hickory Wind is a very country song. I think 100 Years From Now is more of a rock. It has more rock undertones.
I think it's important to say what we mean when we say country sound too. It's even the twang in which it's sang, the cadence, the instrumentation is very much traditional country.
That slide guitar, man.
I was going to say slide guitar, exactly. Yep.
So there's like a Louvin Brothers song in there. So there's a lot of covers, but it's so the lyrics weren't really written by McGuinn and Hillman didn't write anything. They shared a lot of the vocals, and Parsons actually should have the original recordings. Parsons sang lead on more songs, but there was some sort of contract dispute from his Parsons was under contract with another record company, and there was some threats of litigation. So in order to kind of mitigate, I guess, his presence on the album, McGuinn and Hillman re-recorded the vocals, and they sang on some of the songs, including
which is really. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was saying including on 100 Years From Now, which was actually the Parsons composition.
Which is very interesting because Parsons' voice fits much better with this album than Roger McGuinn singing country does. But I would argue the Roger McGuinn songs, for the most part, are songs I like better. And so it would be interesting on some of the songs I liked better if Graham Parsons was singing them, because his voice, Graham Parsons on this album, let's just go right into it. Graham Parsons on this album creates the sound that launched 1,000 alt country bands over the next 40 years, because the way he sounds and the way this album sounds and the songs that he wrote, you can, as we've said before, we use the term draw a straight line often, but rarely is it more apropos than when we think of a variety of bands, especially in the 90s and 2000s, who were influenced by, to the point where this album sounds as if it was their direct father, not just a distant relative.
Yeah, and that's the thing. When this album came out, it was really not well received by the general public. There was two different sides, right? So you had the rock and roll people that had loved the Byrds, felt, what the hell is this? This is not the band that we know and love. This is terrible. This is country.
Well, you've gotten rid of
totally different.
Yeah, you've gotten rid of one of the primary songwriters in Crosby, whose stuff, no matter how you feel about it, you know what it is. And and to me, the Byrds are a jangle pop band.
Right.
That's their legacy. But it's interesting with this because this album also is a legacy of a different type of music.
Yes.
But I don't know if you ever go to the Byrds in your head as forefathers of alt country in the way that you go to them as forefathers of jangle pop.
No, I think that's fair. And I think it's also fair to probably say that this, even though it's a Byrds album, is more overall a Graham Parsons album. It's not just because of what he wrote, but it's that influence. He's the one that directed this album, towards this country sound. And, but it's also interesting too, because the country fans hated this as well. They felt like, who are these hippies? They actually got, I think through some sort of connection, they actually were able to play at the Grand Ole Opry.
I'm sure that went well.
It did not go well. They got booed. Because, and even, they tried to appease the audience, by cutting their hair and trying to present themselves as more country. But the fans really felt like this was some sort of, they were kind of protective of their music and, and their culture. And they felt like this was some sort of hippie, druggy band that was coming in on their turf. And it didn't go well at all. So at the time, there were some positive reviews, but overall this was a forgotten album that pretty much sat in the used bargain bin, basement of a record store. That probably took, I'd say, roughly 20 years or so before it started to really gather some traction with some more modern alt rock artists, most notably Uncle Tupelo with Jay Farrar called this the blueprint, right? Jay Farrar from Uncle Tupelo. And, this was very influential on artists like Gillian Welch and Ryan Adams and, all these other artists that are fairly, they're not massive artists today. They're not topping the charts, but they are, they do have strong followings. And in that sense, this is, it's not like I said, it's not the first country rock album, because there was rockabilly before, there were other things that were happening that were kind of blending the two genres together. But this was the first one that really took like I said, a reputable rock band and and they really tried to do country.
Well, it's got a little bit of that Velvet Underground thing where they joke around and said like only like 200 people bought the original Velvet Underground album, but they all started a band. Yeah. And I feel like that was what this album was like.
That's a good, yes.
But enough about this. Let's talk about this album, because we've got such a juxtaposition here of different albums. Let's lay it all out there.
Yeah, I'm curious, how do you think? Because I know this is what my thing, but how are you?
Well, we haven't really established that. Like Americana, for those who are listening, Americana and this type of rock is really, I don't want to say it's your favorite music, Matt, but it's pretty damn close to the top. Well,
no, it's not. Why don't you
describe a little bit of context of about how you feel about this type of music?
Well, first of all, it took me a while to get into it, right? So I remember, probably back in the late 90s is when the first time I started hearing bands like Uncle Tupelo, Wilco, Sunvolt. That's probably the first. Or Whiskey Town, that's in Ryan Adams' band before he went solo. My brother got really into it. He would play it, and I was kind of, this is country. Why? As soon as I heard the slide guitar, I was like, I don't want any part of this. But I did, I respected him. My uncle, who I've mentioned, I think before as well, was really into this genre as well. And I respect both of them and their opinions. And so I spent a little bit more time getting into it. And then I just appreciated it more, and it really led me down the road to other artists that, kind of follow in the footsteps of this type of genre. Steve Earle, Drive-By Truckers, that were, I just really like it. And I found going to concerts, going to see shows where this type of music was being played, it was a lot of fun. It's a really great, concert environment. And I've really grown to love this. I wouldn't say it's my favorite. I think that there's other bands and types of music, types of rock, really, that I would probably put ahead of this, but it definitely holds a special place for me. And it's fun to go to every now and then. So I knew going into this, I didn't really know this album that well. That's another reason I wanted to do this. I knew some of the songs off of it, but it's one of those things that I just never got around to. So that's another reason why I really wanted to delve into it and listen to more and learn more about it, so that, so I could just add it to my overall musical, repertoire, I guess. But you're a little different, aren't you, John?
Yeah. I don't dislike alt country music, and I would say that I like quite a bit of outlaw country as well, but I'm not as much of a purist in that format as Matt is in many ways. Matt has gone to a ton of shows in this genre. I've gone to select shows. Mm-hmm. Here's how I'm thinking of this album. It is incredibly ambitious, and at the time, and as I said before, it's impossible to hear this album without hearing some of the names that Matt dropped: Wilco, Ryan Adams, those type of bands, as well as even the Americana offshoot that came off of that alt country. So there's a lot of different things with the slide guitar. Slide guitar banjo combo was a lot. As Matt said before, it is a country album, and there wasn't enough rock in it for me for it to truly be a memorable album for me. The two Dylan songs that bookend the album, one having the jangle guitar was nice at the end, nothing was delivered, and You Ain't Going Nowhere is what I would consider to be the tightest song with pop sensibility, which is why it was the single, as much as there was a single on this album.
That was a single, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you can see why it was picked. Besides the pedigree of it being a Dylan song, it's tight, the band sounds good. As I listened to it, I said, wow, if it stays like this, I'm going to really like this album. I didn't dislike it, but once you get to song 3 and The Christian Life, you kind of know that you're getting more a country album than you are an album that sounds like You Ain't Going Nowhere. And by the time you get to Pretty Boy Floyd, you say, okay, this is this is a pretty traditional country album.
Yes.
With the instrumentation. I didn't love Roger McGuinn's voice singing these songs. It didn't sound correct. It sounded inauthentic in many ways to me. And I like Roger McGuinn's voice, but he just seemed miscast as a country singer. Graham Parsons fits a lot better for obvious reasons, both his passion for the genre, but also he has a deeper voice that has more resonance, a little bit more road weary, which I think is part of what country music is always sounds like to me when it's done in the traditional format. So I would say hit and miss, but the Byrds, that early Byrds and Jangle Pop Byrds are definitely my preference.
Yeah. And I don't know. I didn't really get that with McGuinn's voice. I didn't feel like when I heard a song that he was singing that it sounded off to me, or that I was saying, oh, this guy's faking it, or he's not fitting in what I think he should be, or even that he's, light years behind Parsons.
It's like, have you ever gone to karaoke and you hear somebody with a good voice sing like Wonderwall by Oasis, but it doesn't, you know what I mean? But it doesn't quite sound like Noel Gallagher, you know what I mean? And that's kind of like how I felt this was. It was somebody singing country and doing okay and having a good voice, but it just was almost the equivalent of like a karaoke version of it, whereas Graham Parsons was a little bit more of the real item.
Yeah, and that obviously makes sense too. I would say too that I found, listening to this, knowing that this is, people say this is the first country rock album, right? I was searching for where's the rock, right? Because it's if you say country, it just doesn't sound like rock and roll for the most part, but there are parts in here, there's some piano playing on, that's kind of bluesy. I thought that 100 Years From Now, the Parsons song, and then on Nothing Was Delivered, there's some harmonies and some vocals, the stylings that are reminiscent of older Byrds stuff.
Yes, especially Nothing Was Delivered.
Yeah, and I think I'm like, oh, I can see that. That sounds like if you take away some of the country elements, like the slide guitar, banjo, whatever, you could see that being more of a quote unquote traditional Byrds song.
But that honky tonk piano kind of never allows you to get all the way there, because I'm assuming that's Graham Parsons, since you mentioned that he was going to play piano before he played the guitar.
I don't have that in front of me. It could have been.
Okay.
They had some other musicians that were playing. I know McGuinn was on certain parts was trying to play. There was a story that I read that he was trying to play the banjo on one of the songs and he couldn't get it right. So they had some country session musicians in, which was kind of funny because one of the guys was interviewed and he said that, he was used to playing with country artists and they would rock through like 4 songs in 3 hours, right? They were very business oriented. Whereas when he was working with the Byrds, the guys were just hanging around talking for, a couple hours. I'm like, hey, you want to play a song? Yeah, let's play a song, right? It was a more laid back kind of atmosphere. But they did need to haul in some, some Nashville, country musicians so that they could perfect, some of these country sounds. But I also found, I was trying to listen harder, and I think that I was able to really see more of a tie-in between, or the relationship between country music and rock music, because again, the foundation for a lot of this stuff is still both heavily rooted in the blues, right? And it depends on how you interpret that overall sound. So there's certain songs where, and I listened to the Dylan originals after listening to this album, and on Nothing Was Delivered, you can kind of hear, and even on, You Ain't Going Nowhere, you can hear that where the Byrds were using the banjo, that kind of sound, and Dylan and the band were using more of a blues guitar. It's basically the same part, a lot of the same notes and the same progression, but it's a different sound and it's a different feel because, and it's like, I don't know, you can definitely tell one's rock and one's country, but it's still the same song.
Well, and I don't want to delve too much into Nashville Skyline because we're going to cover that in a couple of weeks, so I won't go there. But that you can't listen to that album, having listened to it in preparation for that, and this album without seeing a little bit of evolution. But let me give you another one that we can talk about.
Okay.
I know how I know about Graham Parsons, besides the story of his fireball flame out life. I think he passed away at 26, if I remember correctly.
He was almost 27. He almost made the 27.
Almost 27,
club.
right? So he was close to that club, but he had a very interesting life. But how I know of him is his friendship with Keith Richards,
Yep.
which gets brought up quite a bit. And as a Stones guy, I know that. And I'll give you an evolution that I think does a much better job of fusing country and rock with the blues format. And that's, if you know the song Dead Flowers from Sticky Fingers, that, to me, that takes what Sweetheart of the Radio is trying to do and makes it country rock. And that's a song that has, you absolutely understand that's a blues song, but it has country undertones as well as rock fusing by the way that Mick sings it, the way the drums are played in that song. So if you kind of want to, in my opinion, see something from near the same time period that takes it away from just country and moves it into more of a country rock with the blues and fusion that Matt was getting at, the song Dead Flowers by the Stones is sort of, I think, the evolutionary version of that.
Yeah.
And, Dylan will get there too as well, but I don't think we need to go there yet.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think, because again, I really had to search, for the rock, and I was trying, but I got there, and it wasn't like faking it. There's a couple, and it's not every song. Certainly the Christian Life doesn't really have any rock, any rock in it at all. But I think, and Dead Flowers was actually, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger trying to, that was heavily influenced by Graham Parsons.
Sound like this, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But with a different sensibility that I think, that helped it.
And actually, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger play an interesting role in the whole reason that, because Graham Parsons was only with the Byrds for 5 months. He was kicked out of the band almost 2 months prior to the release of the album. So he was really only there from February of '68 through June of '68. And the big issue was, I guess they were in London playing some shows, and they were talking to Richards and Jagger. And the Byrds had they were planning on playing a tour in South Africa. Right. And Mick and Keith were kind of questioning them on that because of apartheid. And they said, you really shouldn't go there. And Graham Parsons kind of took their side, and they said, he basically refused to go. And McGuinn and Hillman were like, he's not,
Isn't that kind of like a Rolling Stone story, though? Like, I've heard it's just as much like they just wanted to sit around and do a shit ton of drugs. And
that's certainly possible.
I feel like there's a lot of romanticism of certain folks, especially in that era, like the idea that you have to say this is where country rock started because, it makes you seem more literate when you do. But, and I know the apartheid thing. I mean, good on Graham Parsons for making that. But don't you think there's just as much a chance that Graham Parsons just wanted to do a lot of drugs? And the idea of being in South Africa for 5 months might not have been as appealing.
Yeah, well, the other thing, that was one thing that I read, and I'm like not a historian, so I'm just, kind of reporting what I saw. There's also a lot of reports that, that there was a lot of tension between McGuinn and Parsons because, Parsons, this is McGuinn's band for so many years. He was the lead guy, and now you got Parsons coming in and really.
Well, and you already just shoved out David Crosby, and now you get this other like iconoclast coming in this place. I'm sure it's kind of like Jesus.
Yeah, and there was reports that he was, asking for more money and trying to get a bigger piece of the pie and that type of thing. And, so McGuinn said later on, that they were fine, that there was no problem, but it totally makes sense that there was some sort of friction there. So I'm sure that played a part of it as well. But the story that I saw was basically that, they kicked him out after he refused to go to South Africa with them. So, and then he went on to form the Flying Burrito Brothers, and a couple months later, Hillman joined him. So Hillman quit the Byrds, and that was basically it for the Byrds. I mean, McGuinn kept going with the band, but he was really the only guy that was still, the only original member that was in the band after that. So
it's kind of the death knell of the Byrds as an album too.
Yeah, and I did read that they all the original members came together for an album later on. I forget exactly what year, but it included,
Does that include Gene Clark?
It does, yes.
Okay.
Gene Clark, both the Michael Clark, the drummer, and they're not related. They just happen to have the same last name, spelled differently though, but still. So, but yeah, they had an album and Crosby, they all came back, but it wasn't really well received. I haven't listened to it. I don't know what it sounds like, but it doesn't sound like from the reviews that it's worth going to. So, but what I do recommend is, Parsons, he did a couple albums with the Flying Burrito Brothers. He did a couple of solo albums. He was really, he did a lot of stuff with Emmylou Harris, for anybody who knows her, who's a very prominent, country, singer. But he did overdose on heroin because, of course, he did. And there's a really funny movie that's called Grand Theft Parsons. It stars Johnny Knoxville as one of Parsons' buddies. So this is based on a true story that essentially Parsons was estranged from his family and his father in particular. And when he died, the family wanted to fly him back to his home and have him buried. But Johnny Knoxville, his buddy, he made an agreement with him saying, if one of us dies, you have to spread our ashes over, by the Joshua Tree in California. So Grand Theft Parsons is the story of his buddy stealing Graham Parsons' body at the airport hangar and in an attempt to try to bury his ashes or spread his ashes at the Joshua Tree. So it's a good movie, even if you don't know who Graham Parsons is. The character's not in it at all, but it's a pretty funny movie starring Johnny Knoxville. So yeah, that's John. So are you going to recommend this to you'd recommend it to anybody at all?
If you are an alt country fan, absolutely, because it's certainly I think it's a necessary listen to see where your genre came from, or for that matter, Americana. It's got to be part of your canon. For everybody else, I think I'd probably direct people to the Basement Tapes or some other albums that followed shortly afterwards that did a better job, in my opinion, of fusing country and rock together. If you lean more to the countryside and you want to see the early genesis of mainstream country, I guess outside of the traditional places the country was played, go for it. So if you're a country fan, Americana fan, alt country, you're going to like this. If you're someone who's a little bit more of a pop music fan, or you like the turn Byrds or the jangle poppy guitars and country's not really your thing, I don't know if this one's going to be for you.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I probably would give the same recommendation. I think particular songs for me that stand out, I do agree. You Ain't Going Nowhere is great. I think Parsons' Hickory Wind is a beautiful song. Those are the two that stand out for me. I enjoyed this from front to back. It's a fun listen for me. It's not too long. I think it's just a little over 30 minutes. Yeah. So, they're like anything else at this time. You've got some extra tracks, which kind of sounds strange. I mean, if you just listen to it, and then you'll know when the extra tracks start, because there's a deviation there. But it's an important piece of art for this type of genre. And like John said, if you want to have a better understanding of where a lot of this Americana, roots rock, alt country stuff came from, or influenced by, this is certainly a place to go.
And this will be a good touch point for us when we get to Nashville Skyline too, because it's going to follow on some of the themes, and even I think some of the stuff overlaps in terms of the recording, because it was Basement Tape era, correct?
Yeah, I think it was later. I don't have my years in front of me, but it's all around that late 60s time for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We'll make sure we have the answers when we get there.
That's right.
A couple weeks, right? So
I wasn't prepared for Nashville Skyline, John. You're throwing me curveballs.
Well, we're just free for a minute today. You know what I mean? Just spitballing a little bit. So